Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be at the Miller Center, which is the foremost center of thought about the American presidency and more broadly about the U.S. government. I stand as a proud alum of 30 years of service for one outpost of the federal government that continues to function exceedingly well. Perhaps the most important thing I can say to you today is that as taxpayers, I believe you'd be proud of the job that is done on a daily basis by the civil servants that populate the halls of the Federal Reserve System. I am going to talk about some challenges that the Federal Reserve confronts in the conduct of monetary policy, but in talking about those challenges, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is an institution that continues to function well, is clearly focused on the mission that it's been assigned by the United States Congress, and attempts to do its best on behalf of every resident of this country. You probably came expecting to hear about the Federal Reserve. I want to instead talk a little bit about the fire department here just at the beginning. Now, if a representative of the fire department was standing in front of you and used the word fire, I hope you would not have the reaction of, gee, we need to run for the exits. And you probably, I hope, would not have the reaction of imminent danger, but instead a sense that it's a good thing that the fire department is doing prudent planning and that we ought to have a conversation now while the building is not burning about whether the sprinklers are up to code and the equipment that's over in the station is adequate to face the challenge of the next fire. So despite the fact that the word recession is in the title of my talk, I want you to think about it as an exercise in prudent planning, just as if it were a conversation with the fire marshal. I want to further underscore that right now this is an exercise in advanced planning, and that the U.S. economy is in very strong strong shape from the perspective of a macroeconomist. And I've given you a little bit of data to substantiate that. As you know, unemployment is within is near a 50-year low. The last time it was this low was in the late 1960s. And it's low not only in absolute terms, but also relative to a measure of an estimate of what can be sustained in the longer run, consistent without increasing inflation pressures. And this estimate happens to come from the Congressional Budget Office, and that's shown by the orange line. And the fact that the blue line is as far below the orange line as it is signifies that the labor market is in pretty tight condition right now. Monthly job creation continues at a solid pace. Its average over the past 3 months is about 150,000. That's down a bit from last year. Last year it was running more in the neighborhood of about 225,000 per year. There's been an awful lot of furrowed brows and hand-wringing over the fact that the pace of job creation has slowed, but this was inevitable, and it needed to happen. Herb Stein, who was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Nixon in the 1970s, was famous for saying that if a trend can't continue, it won't. And so this is an example where job creation couldn't continue at the earlier pace. It had to slow, and that itself is not a sign of impending recession. So those are two very good indicators about one leg of the so-called dual mandate, which is the assignment given to the Federal Reserve by the Congress. The other leg has to do with inflation, and inflation is in very good shape as well. It's been low and stable. Students of economics know that during the 1970s, inflation got up into double digits. There's been quite a lot of sort of furrowed brows and hand-wringing over the fact that inflation actually over the past half dozen years has been running a little below the Fed's 2% target. But this record of inflation, with inflation running on average about 1.5%, over the past half dozen years or so is extraordinarily good inflation control. It's impossible for a central bank to control inflation with pinpoint precision. This is about as good as it gets. So the broad summary, the backdrop for our conversation today is that the economy today is in extraordinarily good shape. I know that there are communities and individuals, particularly rural communities, African Americans, Hispanics, the farm sector. There are pockets of continued distress where prosperity is not in evidence, but by and large, those pockets of continued economic distress are not susceptible to action from the Federal Reserve. From the point of view of a central bank, this is about what we can deliver, and the rest of it is up to, there are important actions to be taken, but those actions need to be taken by other decision makers in the economy. Now, the problem is that with the economy as strong as it is right now, this is about as strong as it's going to get, there should be plenty of ammunition stored up for the Fed to fight the next recession, and that simply is not the case. And so we know, just as a fire marshal would say, prudent planning requires that we be prepared for the next fire. We know that the business cycle has not been repealed. We know that there will be a next recession. We also know, by the way, that macroeconomic forecasters won't be able to anticipate that event with any precision. And the issue is that monetary policy and fiscal policy are not well prepared today to confront that. And that's the core of what I want to talk with you about. Now, it turns out that there actually are three aspects of this problem of monetary and fiscal policy makers either being in fact constrained in their ability to fight the next recession or perceiving themselves as constrained in their ability to fight the next recession. The first problem is that the Fed's conventional policy tool is a short-term interest rate called the federal funds rate. And that rate remains very low today, despite the fact that the economy is in historically strong condition. As you can see all the way, well, maybe you can see, the Federal Reserve has lowered the funds rate now to between 1.75% and 2%. And that is historically low relative to where it was 2 and 3 decades before. And the problem is that zero is a big issue in the world of interest rates. We used to think that interest rates literally couldn't go below zero, because if interest rates went below zero, everybody would hold cash. Cash pays a zero rate of return, not so attractive in a normal environment, but if your bank account is paying you minus 50 basis points, then cash begins to look like a better investment. So we used to think that zero was literally the floor for interest rates. The Swiss and others have shown us that zero isn't quite the floor, but it still is a pretty good approximation for how low interest rates can go. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve said in the last time that interest rates got really, really low in the throes of the Great Crisis, Fed said, we're not going to take interest rates into negative territory. So zero is a pretty good lower bound for how low interest rates can go. And that means that there's only 2 percentage points of easing room for the Federal Reserve to use when the economy next goes into recession. So that's the first dimension of problem. Now, the second dimension of problem is that the Fed has some other tools available to it, some of which it used in the context of the Great Recession, and those two have some confinement around them in terms of their availability to fight the next recession. One of the things that the Fed, so this graph just gives you a little bit of context. In the last 3 recessions, the Fed cut the short-term funds rate by 5 percentage points or a little bit more. And right now, it's only got about 2 percentage points of room. So we're about 3 percentage points short of space on the short-term funds rate. One of the tools that the Fed used to fight the Great Recession was it bought an awful lot of longer-term securities and expanded its balance sheet massively by about, it ran up its balance sheet to about $4 trillion with a T. And that, as you can see, was way outside the range of prior experience. What was the idea there? It was nothing more complicated than simple supply and demand. That if the Fed went in as a ready buyer into the market and bought those longer term securities, it would drive the price up because it would be taking supply out of the market. So those longer term bonds would have a higher price. And in one of the everlastingly confusing aspects of the bond market, when the price goes up, the yield goes down. If that's not second nature to you, you'll just have to take my word for that. It's true. The other thing that the Fed did was it also bought mortgage-backed securities that had been guaranteed by the U.S. Treasury, and that provided some support to the housing market, which, as you know, was struggling mightily at that point. Now, the situation that we confront, if there were a recession here in the very near term, the Fed's portfolio was already quite a bit larger than it was on the eve of the last recession. And boy, the Fed caught a lot of flack for these purchases. My own view, as an acknowledged partisan of the Federal Reserve, was that it was absolutely the right thing to do. It was necessary. It was also politically costly for the institution. And I'm concerned that policymakers might decide not to be as aggressive in their purchases. But more than that, here's the bigger problem. This action and some other steps that the Fed took that I won't go into, all were aimed at driving down longer-term interest rates. And longer-term interest rates themselves are already really low. The 10-year Treasury rate is at about 1.75% right now. And here's the problem. In the last 3 recessions, the 10-year Treasury rate declined by about 2.5 to 3 percentage points. And right now, there's only 1.75 percentage points of room for the 10-year Treasury rate to go down. So no matter what the Fed does, it could buy longer-term securities till the cows come home. It could issue promises that it won't raise the funds rate for a long time into the future. All of those steps are aimed to operate through the pipe of longer-term interest rates, and there just isn't scope for longer-term interest rates to come down and provide as much support to borrowing, investing, capital expenditure, hiring, as was accomplished in each of the past 3 recessions. Now, the third dimension of the problem, so those are the 2 dimensions of monetary policy, and there the constraints are quite real. The third dimension has to do with fiscal policy, and here I think the constraint is more perceived. I'm concerned that fiscal policymakers will say, gee, the federal debt held by the public is already pushing 80%. That's as high as it's been since World War II. It would not be fiscally prudent for us to run it up even more. In fact, for reasons that perhaps we can get into in the Q&A portion of the discussion, I think that's exactly the way we need to go. And so I'm concerned here that fiscal policymakers may draw a boundary around what they can do that is more self-imposed than reality-imposed. So I think we need to keep a careful eye on exactly that. Now, I'm not exactly a defeatist. There are some important steps that the Fed can take. One thing that they need to do, in my view, is continue to run the economy hot and eventually, it has to be the case that eventually, if the economy runs hot for long enough, that inflation will come up. Boy, if that isn't true, then we're in deep trouble. My own view is that the Fed should further raise its inflation target from 2% to 3%. And that by doing that, if we can get actual inflation up to 3%, that will give more room for the Fed to ease nominal interest rates the next time a recession comes around. And so the Fed will be creating another 100 basis points of space for itself if it raises the inflation target. It's got to be followed by action. It's got to be followed by actual follow-through on the inflation rate. And everybody in this room, if the Fed announces that, everybody in this room will first say, okay, show me, because we all have a little bit of Missouri inside ourselves. But if the Fed can demonstrate that it can get inflation up to 3%, then it will have created some more policy space for itself. And the Fed needs to take some steps that, again, perhaps we can discuss in the Q&A session to commit to a policy that says we will hold the funds rate lower for longer than we have historically. On the fiscal policy side, mainly what we need to do is have our fiscal policymakers understand the implication of worldwide lower interest rates is that the cost of debt is much lower than it used to be 30 years ago. And therefore, like anything else, if the price goes down or the cost goes down, it's prudent to reassess and contemplate having more of that on your balance sheet. The Fed is in the process right now of a policy framework review, and they're undertaking a lot of internal staff studies that are only dimly reflected in the meeting minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee. But there's ample evidence that there's good scholarship and deep excavation that's being done by the Federal Reserve staff, not only at the board in Washington, but at 12 reserve banks. And they're also engaging in lots of conversations around the country under the umbrella of under a moniker of Fed Listens events. But we urgently need to take advantage of this opportunity that the Fed has created with this framework review. That framework review gives the Fed an opportunity once in a long while to announce a really material break in the way that it conducts monetary policy. Not the day-to-day decisions, but the strategic framework for conducting monetary policy. And that's what I have to say.
Great. Thanks. So I'm going to ask some kind of big picture questions, and then some really we're just going to get in the weeds. So I hope you all are ready for that. Kind of really big picture.
You mean we weren't there already?
We're going to get even more in the weeds.
Okay.
I see some students in the room, so I want to make sure they get their money's worth. But very big picture, we know politically that the chairman of the Federal Reserve is appointed off cycle from presidential elections, so that there's a, if not de facto, but at least de jure independence from the political cycle. And you talked about it within the context of these three problems. Problem number 3, to me, seems clearly a political problem. This is political will on the part of members of Congress and the chief executive to engage in negotiation that leads to fiscal stimulus. Problem number 1, which is the conventional tool, the federal funds rate, this is squarely in the hands of the Federal Reserve Board. The question I have for you is with regard to problem number 2. Right, and you talk about the Fed's balance sheet and the problem that the Fed's balance sheet is already at or above $4 trillion, trillion with a T, $4 trillion. And you mentioned that pushing it even further could be politically costly or politically challenging. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where authorization comes from. Does it require legislative authorization? And then talk about how this might be politically costly and how maybe it was during the recession.
Okay, great, thank you. So one thing that it allows me to emphasize and underscore is, I said at the outset that you'd be proud of the way that the Fed conducts itself, you as taxpayers would be proud of that. One dimension of that which never, ever meets sort of the public press or anything else is the scrupulous adherence to the statutory authority that the Congress has given to the Fed. So the authority to purchase those securities is there in the Federal Reserve Act, and it's interesting. The way the law is written, the Federal Reserve is prohibited from purchasing any longer-term security that is not issued by or guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury. So what that means is the Fed can purchase two kinds of securities. One are Treasury debt, just the sort of normal plain vanilla. And then I mentioned there was this other animal that I mentioned, mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, the reason why the Fed can issue those is because the Treasury already guarantees the credit performance of those securities. So when the Fed purchases those, there is no credit risk. So the first thing I wanted to say as an unabashed fan and partisan of the unreconstructed reserve is just this scrupulous adherence to the statutory authority. I'm confident that, now, I also mentioned that the Fed took enormous guff, and I was one of the sort of nameless, faceless people who was sitting behind the chair, or Chair Bernanke in that case, or Vice Chair Don Cohn at congressional hearings, and I can tell you the vitriol was just astonishing that was leveled at the Federal Reserve. Partly I think, frankly, because it was novel. The Fed hadn't done this in a very long time. This was a technique that was buried in the law from 1935, I believe it was. But the vitriol was astonishing, and perhaps the sort of human interest side of it is that the personal courage that was required by Ben Bernanke, by Donald Cohn, by other key members of the decision-making inner circle, the personal courage was huge, and perhaps the place where it was most on display was in those congressional testimonies. The accusation was that by taking on to its balance sheet, the Fed was taking enormous risk and would lose huge volumes of taxpayer money. Well, actually, the answer is much more boring than that. As one of my charts showed, the Fed has already begun to let those securities roll off. And what's happened is the taxpayers have been repaid every penny on those purchases of longer-term securities, together with interest. And so the Fed doesn't conduct monetary policy in order to be a profit center for the United States government, but an ancillary fact of the way that it has conducted monetary policy over the past decade is that it has made tens of billions of dollars on behalf of the American taxpayer, while in service of the far more important mission of restoring the macroeconomy to health. Now, the fact of the matter is, the Fed, as I said, could purchase those longer-term securities all day long, every day, ad infinitum, but it still won't be able to drive those longer-term interest rates down below zero. So there is a limit.
So they have statutory authorization to do it. Economically, it's going to be ineffective given how low long-term rates are. And so what it sounds like, in addition, as you're suggesting, in addition to raising the target to 3%, there needs to be, from your perspective, there needs to be concerted effort to try and generate some sort of fiscal stimulus, especially because interest rates are just so unbelievably low.
Fiscal policy, which is taxes and spending, is going to need to play a bigger role in the next recession than it has on average historically, because monetary policy, even with the aggressive steps that I've outlined and believe that the Fed should take and have been busy advocating for, monetary policy isn't going to be able to deliver the goods.
I appreciated your statement that zero really isn't zero. When we're talking about interest rates, that's fascinating, right? That's a take-home in and of itself. But let's continue to go down this path a little bit. You know, there's a few things, and I talked to David about this beforehand. There's a few things that if you're a Fed watcher or you're a watcher of the markets, you know, a few things have been, for the extent to which they are headline material, they've been headline material over the last month, and two really stick out. The first is that about 5 or 6 weeks ago, there was a big hullabaloo about the recession is coming, and we know this because the yield curve is inverted. Run for the hills, right? The yield curve is inverted. It's always been a leading indicator of a recession. Oh my gosh, the yield curve is inverted. Can you tell us a little bit about what that actually means in practice and whether we should be as terrified as the talking heads on TV tell us we should be?
Sure. So because I had a little advance warning that this was coming, I came with slides, malice aforethought here in the form of a couple of slides. I think this yield curve topic is pretty hard to visualize unless this is what you do from day to day. So because we're at one of the great educational institutions in the country, let's take the opportunity to do a little learning and step back and get a bigger picture of what the heck this yield curve thing is. Now, the Treasury borrows at different maturities. And so some of the borrowing that the Treasury does is a promise to repay after 3 months. Some of it's a promise to repay after 1 year. Some of it's a promise to repay after 10 years or 30 years. And lately, even, there's been some talk about ultra-long bonds. If you take, now, the people who lend to the Treasury can charge different rates at those different horizons. And if you take the rates that the lenders charge and you plot them, I wonder if we could get the slides back. If you plot those on a graph, there we go, what you get is the yield curve. And this is the thing that there's been as much hullabaloo as David LeBlanc was saying. Here's what the yield curve looked like a year ago when the Treasury borrowed at 3 months horizon. It was paying about 2.25%. At the 5-year horizon, it was paying 3%, and at 30 years, it was paying 3.25%. So that is the famous yield curve that you've heard about. And that's the normal shape, by the way, where the Treasury has to pay a little more in order to borrow at longer horizons. Now, the interesting thing is what's happened over the year subsequent to when those rates prevailed in the market. And what's happened is that there's a perception that through some combination of the economy slowing, or maybe the structural characteristics of the economy are a little different than what we thought, and maybe the Fed Reserve is going to need to deliver a more accommodative policy than everybody thought, the whole structure of interest rates has come down. The other thing, this is the part where the hullabaloo comes in, is that if you squint very hard, you can see that the curve now, instead of being gently upward sloping, is basically flat out almost through 10 years, and it's only got a little bit of an uptick there at the 30-year end. Now, why on earth would you be concerned about that? Well, the answer is the historical track record. And there's a phrase that you might hear from time to time called a yield curve inversion. If the yield curve is upward sloping, in other words, if longer borrowing maturities are associated with higher interest rates, that's not inverted. If longer borrowing maturities are associated with lower borrowing rates, that's an inverted yield curve. And so what do we get? What do we get if we calculate over time the difference between the 10-year rate, which is plotted right here, and the 3-month rate? That thing is called the slope of the yield curve. And if you remember back to high school geometry, slope is just rise over run, y equals mx plus b. It's nothing more complicated than that. It's just the difference between the 10-year rate and the 3-month rate. So now what I'm going to show you is a plot of that difference over time. And what you can see is really quite a remarkable regularity. These shaded stripes, which you may not be able to see from the audience, are recession periods. And what you see is that the difference between the 10-year rate and the 3-month rate plunges a little bit before those recession periods. And that's what economic forecasters are looking for, is some kind of a reliable indicator. As indicators go, this one is pretty darn good. And the hullabaloo that David LeBlanc was mentioning was just recently we got into inverted territory. Now, what that says is that investors are looking ahead and saying, we're placing bets of many, many, many billions of dollars that interest rates, that short-term interest rates a little further ahead are not going to be any higher than they are today. They may even be lower if we think that there's a recession on the horizon, because in that context, the Fed will be cutting interest rates. And so that's the story that this indicator is telling you. It's a bet by financial market participants that the Fed is at heightened risk of cutting interest rates a little bit ahead. Now, is it cause and effect? Does it have to be that way? If the yield curve has inverted, will it necessarily be the case that a recession will be on our doorstep 3 months or 6 months from now? The answer to that is no. Fed's bound and determined to try to tip the odds, but monetary policy is a risky business. And chips and dents happen not only in the appliance delivery business, but also in the monetary policy business. And if you're not prepared for that, it's the wrong business to be in. So despite the fact that they're going to do their level best to sustain the expansion, and they've already taken a couple of steps by lowering the funds rate by a total of 50 basis points, it's clear that we're in a period here of heightened fragility where things could go wrong.
Okay. So that makes me both nervous and relieved, so thank you. Thank you for that.
That's about appropriate.
Great, excellent. At the median, I feel really comfortable.
Maybe I need to shift that a little more toward the nervous.
Right. We're going to have some time for Q&A from the audience, so I want you all to start thinking about what your questions are. I'm going to ask, pitch you a softball, or perhaps not a softball, and it's just about the politics surrounding the Fed at this moment. I've been studying macroeconomic policy since graduate school, so undergraduate and graduate school, so 30 years now. And we know that from time to time, as you were talking about, the vitriol that was directed at Chairman Bernanke from members of Congress, Rand Paul especially, was something that I hadn't seen before. But I'd never seen it, and again, I looked historically, I've never seen the kind of critique, to put it mildly, vitriol, to maybe put it more appropriately, from the chief executive directed at the Federal Reserve System and the chairman of the Fed. And so I'm just wondering, about how you think about this and how you respond to this as somebody who has been involved in the system for so long. What does this mean for the ability of the Fed to recruit the best economists we have to work in that office and to work in an environment that is supposed to be, by statute, right? It's supposed to be independent. And so I don't really have a question. I'm asking you if you can reflect on the current state of things.
Okay, so since we're at the Miller Center, let me offer a couple of comments sort of from a longer term perspective. One is political incursions are not literally unprecedented in the history of the Fed. So there's a famous instance where LBJ, I believe, had the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, William McChesney Martin, at his ranch in Texas, and I believe it was there that LBJ physically shoved Martin against the wall in a rather a physically threatening way to express LBJ's unhappiness over the conduct of monetary policy at that time, where the Fed wouldn't accommodate both the domestic spending that LBJ wanted to take and the conduct of the Vietnam War. There have been instances where particular members of Congress were just extremely hostile toward the Fed. It's a very, very complicated situation. I guess I'd say that one thing that is different in the realm of presidential conduct is that in the earlier instances of which I'm aware, most of the criticism was delivered behind the scenes. So the world didn't observe when LBJ thrust William McChesney Martin against the wall at his ranch. Today's criticism is launched by Twitter, and I think quite overtly for the purpose of maximizing the public voice with which that criticism is delivered. I guess I would say the second point I'd make that's perhaps relevant from the place that we sit today, the Miller Center, is that the response, I think, underscores the importance of the personal character, the integrity, the commitment to public service of the people who are in those important roles at the time. And so, I think Jay Powell, the current chair, has responded magnificently. Frankly, in my view, it's the only way that he can respond, despite the fact that it must be the case that every fiber of his being is crying out to, in some way, retaliate. But the Federal Reserve is an interesting animal in the constellation of the U.S. government. It's an independent institution. And by dint of that grant of independence, the Fed also takes on obligations of accountability and transparency and restraint. And what we can't have is a bunch of, I'll use a tame term, know-it-alls at 20th and Constitution in Washington, D.C., that's the address of the Federal Reserve Board, pretending that they know better than the elected representatives of government, or getting out of their lane and undertaking assignments that are not granted to it by the Congress. And so what you've seen, I think, is just an immensely talented and disciplined adherence to the role that has been given to Chair Powell. He has refrained from getting out of his lane and stayed with an unrelenting focus on the assignment that is given to him by statute, which is to conduct monetary policy. And the frustrating part is that, if he takes criticism from the outside, that makes the job that much tougher. But there is no viable response other than to keep your eye relentlessly on the ball.
Thanks. So do we have questions? I just want to gauge how many questions you have. All right, so why don't we start here, because she's closer, right? And then we'll work our way around. And we're going to be mindful of short answers and concise responses so that we can try and get as many people involved as possible.
Good morning. I was wondering how the Fed, what the opinion is of the Fed on what seems to be recent bubbles in the economy, including student loan bubble, the credit card bubble, the auto loan bubble, perhaps the real estate bubble. And it seems that some of these bubbles are potentially fueled by the low interest rates set by the Fed. What is your opinion on that?
So there's a widespread recognition of the potential importance of those things. And each of those that you describe in and of themselves is a really complicated and important issue and deserves a longer description. How can I summarize it? It's a part of the situation there. Let me see if I can touch on two aspects of it. One is that it's easy to lose track of the fact that monetary policy is not the whole game, and that there are other policy tools that need to be brought to bear. And let me just reference the student loan situation as an example of that. By and large, so student loans is a really scary problem. But by and large, the solution to that problem is outside the realm of the Federal Reserve. For the most part, perhaps it will not come as a surprise at the University of Virginia. Investment in higher education remains a high rate of return investment. There are segments of the educational industry that are a terrible rate of return investment. And so I think my own view is we need to do much more to shine a light on what investments in higher education remain high rate of return investments and what remain or are terrible investments in education, where you're at high risk of not graduating, and if you graduate, your earnings will not be higher than they would have been if you had never attended the institution. Now, those problems are a great example of things that are outside the lane of the Federal Reserve. What we need to do is to have a policy, and this is a complicated idea, but it arises in what we need to do is have policy that's sophisticated enough to allow two problems to be separated. We need to allow the Federal Reserve to run low interest rates when the macroeconomy calls for it in order to support the real economy and keep inflation close to target. And we need separately to have policy that ensures that student loan borrowing, a realistic, plausible prospect of leading to a better standard of living rather than a worse one. That second category of problem is not in the Federal Reserve's mandate. We need to have stronger policy in that area precisely in order to allow the Fed to run low interest rates when it's called for. So the issue that you're raising is a very real one, but it's not the Fed's problem to solve, and the Fed will get out of the lane that's defined by its independence if it begins to meddle in the issue of student loans.
Great. I saw two hands over here, or now a bunch of hands. Why don't we collect the questions, and that way we can see how many we can get through. So we'll just start in the back and get these three questions. Let's taking a look at the
Hi,
time.
I moved here from the Heartland. Elkhart County takes pride in being one of the largest producers of the RV industry. And economically, at this point, production is down about 20%. And they have considered that an indicator in the Midwest of the economy. So I hear from friends, there's a recession coming. What do you think? I know in the last one, Warren Buffett owned Forest River, and that tanked. We vied for first place and second place in the highest rate of unemployment in the last recession.
And I missed the key, there's one key word, and that was the industry that you mentioned.
RVs.
RVs, thank you.
Yeah.
I would like some comment on the, you could say, non-U.S. holders of American debt, such as Japan, China. And I guess this is in the area of the second weapon, long-term rates. What is it that prevents or makes very unlikely that large holders of U.S. debt decide not to sell? What are the risks that China might change its view in this trade war situation and decide, despite the downside risk for them, that they would sell off? And how would that affect the Fed's capacity to respond?
And I think we have one more question right here. Quick question. Hang on, wait for the mic. You're being recorded for posterity. Right here, raise your hand. There you go.
Quick question. What percentage in the Congress do you think understands the Federal Reserve and all of its policies?
Okay, so you've got 5 minutes to answer all or none of these questions. I mean, I love it that we've got an American politics question, we've got a question about industry, and we got a foreign policy question. That's what we do here at the Miller Center, right?
Let's see, I think I'll dispense with the third question quickly by saying less than 100% and more than 0. I will say that there are some members of Congress who understand what the Fed does and at quite a deep level, quite a deep and sophisticated level. It's not universal, and in that regard, the members of Congress are not any different than the members of the general public. It's a institution that conducts some activities that are difficult for people in their ordinary lives to understand, and it is for that reason why Jay Powell, why it's so important that Powell continue in the tradition of, particularly really of Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, to explain what the Fed is doing in clear, understandable terms and why it's doing it, and what the limits of Fed power are, and where the Fed will act aggressively and where it cannot go. And all of those, communicating all of that to people who, sadly, not all the population, to my distress, has had graduate level courses in monetary economics. And it's not a job requirement for members of Congress, nor should it be. But it just underscores how incredibly important it is to try to communicate clearly about what the business of the Fed is and why it's taking these actions to deliver on the mandate given to it by the Congress. Perhaps you may react to my talk today as documenting further just how difficult it is to communicate clearly about these issues. But it's incredibly important to continue trying.
We got about a minute.
Non-U.S. holders of American debt, it's a really interesting situation, but we're sort of, we're kind of locked, it's as if we're locked in an embrace with one another, and it's a moment that is fraught with tension in the relationship, but The first order effect of China deciding to sell their massive portfolio of U.S. securities would be that they take an enormous capital loss, because if they dumped those securities on the market, the price would go down very significantly. It underscores, in my view, the importance of why we need to find a productive path to a cooperative relationship, not only in the security realm, but the economic realm as well. Elkhart County, it's famous mainly in my mind because once upon a time, a long time ago, it was one of the most famous places for the manufacture of orchestral instrument, the French horn. That business is no longer there. The RV business may be suffering now. The heartland experience, and particularly the manufacturing sector, illustrates and underscores a comment that I made toward the beginning of my talk about how not every segment of the country, not every geographic area, not every demographic group is feeling prosperity, despite the fact that in aggregate, on average, things are doing well. But Elkhart County is probably a living example of a place that is continues to lag. Again, because the Fed conducts monetary policy with a national view, it really doesn't have tools to reach into particular industries, communities, or demographic groups. That needs to fall on the shoulders of other policymakers.
So I'm going to ask members of the audience to hold their seats for a moment. The Governing Council has to get to a meeting, as do David and I. And so as you hold your seats, please join me in thanking David Wilcox.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today.